Sons and daughters, colleagues, veterans will all have a part to play, and more families will know what sacrifice for our nation means.
British families must be ready to send their sons and daughters to defend the nation, the head of the UK military has warned. Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, Chief of the Defence Staff, said more people need to be prepared to take up arms. While a direct Russian attack on UK soil does remain unlikely, he stressed the risk is not zero. Speaking at a Royal United Services Institute event in Westminster, Sir Richard urged schools and universities to encourage careers in defence and the arms industry. He warned that civilians will need to play a part in building national resilience to keep the country functioning in a crisis.
Today, the UK is subject to an onslaught of cyber attacks from Russia. And we know that Russian agents are seeking to conduct sabotage and have killed on our shores. But Russia's hard power is growing quickly. The Russian armed forces are now more than 1.1 million strong, consuming more than 7% of GDP and around 40% of government spending, which is a sum that has more than doubled over the past decade. While I've argued that Russia's campaign in Ukraine has so far been a strategic failure, with NATO bigger, more united, stronger, and spending increased amounts on rearmament, we should be under no illusions that Russia has a massive, increasingly technically sophisticated, and now highly combat experienced military. But it is absolutely clear that Russia's hard power is something to fear. But what about Russia's intent to use it? The war in Ukraine and Russia's track record shows Putin's willingness to target neighboring states, including their children and civilian populations. The Russian leadership has made clear that it wishes to challenge, limit, divide, and ultimately destroy NATO. In former President Medvedev's words, aspiring to the disappearance of Ukraine and the disappearance of NATO, preferably both. Despite these clear indications, I'm not sure yet that we feel this threat in the UK as acutely as many of our allies in Europe. As the philosopher Nietzsche said, where we stand depends on where we sit. I spoke recently to the Danish ambassador here in the UK. Over the past few years, she served in Estonia, then Sweden, and now in London. She described how viscerally the threat was felt in Estonia, and then how she saw the issue grow in prominence when she was in Sweden. Now she's in London, she observed that these discussions are generally confined to people like us here tonight. So these arguments can cut through. It is clear to our allies that the risk to NATO and to the UK from Russia is growing. In reality, other than proximity, the threat in the UK isn't really any different to the threat in Germany, for example. And unless we're able to raise awareness and stimulate the conversation with society about the risks, we can't expect the rest of government, society, and industry to act or bear the costs. But this can't be just a conversation about risk. We also have to explain how we should respond. Our objective must be to avoid war. However we choose to define the cost, whether that is in lives lost, misery, or economic impact, war is enormously costly. And I know I don't need to tell this audience that while the price of peace may be rising, the cost of strong deterrence is still far, far less than the cost of war. Sons and daughters, colleagues, veterans will all have a part to play, to build, to serve, and if necessary, to fight. And more families will know what sacrifice for our nation means. That's why it's so important that we do explain the changing threat and the need to stay ahead of it.
The UK government has committed to increasing defence and security spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, reflecting the rising costs of maintaining peace in a dangerous world. His warning comes alongside the new head of MI6, Blaise Machiavelli, who said Britain is now in a space between peace and war. She described Russia's tactics as testing the West below the threshold of open conflict, including cyber attacks, sabotage, propaganda, and efforts to exploit societal divisions. Metrovelli said hostile states are rewriting the rules of warfare, creating an age of uncertainty for the UK. These warnings come as diplomatic efforts continue to end the war in Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky said a draft peace plan discussed with US officials in Berlin could be finalised in the coming days, offering a potential path towards reducing tensions in Europe.
This video is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Protect yourself this Christmas with one of the best VPNs out there. Cybercriminals are out to get your bank account information while you do your Christmas shopping online. But you can protect your privacy, money, and identity now with ExpressVPN for as little as 8 pence a day. Click the link now to claim up to 75% off.
Well, elsewhere, European leaders, including the Prime Minister, met last night in Berlin ahead of a potential Ukraine peace deal.
Sir Keir Starmer said that Britain cannot let up in its efforts to bring about a just and lasting peace.
Well, joining us live now from Berlin is our chief political correspondent, Catherine Forster. Morning to you, Catherine. Let's start with President Trump, shall we, who has now filed that $10 billion lawsuit against the BBC. He said he'd do it.
Yes, he said he'd do it, and now he has, filing a lawsuit for up to $10 billion in damages against the BBC. He's accusing them as fake news. He said that they literally put words in his mouth. This, of course, is over that Panorama documentary that went out just a week before the American election, in which they spliced together 2 bits of a speech he made at the day of the Capitol riots that January, and put them together. They were actually an hour apart, but the BBC put them together in a way that made it look like he'd said, we will march to the Capitol building and we will fight, we will fight. This has been filed in Florida. The reason for that is that there's a limit of a year on a defamation suit. Obviously, we're over a year now, but in Florida, there's up to 2 years. That's why it's happened there. Now, I don't think for a minute that they're going to end up having to pay £10 billion, but they might have to pay something. And they did issue an apology. That's what Donald Trump originally asked for. And the BBC did give that apology, but he's decided that he's going to sue them anyway.
We're in Berlin because of the peace talks that have been going on there, and actually very optimistic sounds coming from both sides.
Yes, well, last night we heard of significant progress. Berlin has been at the centre of intense diplomatic negotiations over the last few days. The American negotiation team, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, have been here talking with President Zelensky, and then last night about a dozen European leaders, including the Prime Minister, on a very brief visit. They feel positive and optimistic. Donald Trump has said that they are closer now than we have ever been. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz saying that a ceasefire now seems possible. NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table, but it sounds like robust security guarantees, the equivalent of Article 5, are being offered by the US and Europe, which is big progress. Also talk of a multinational force, but of course what we don't know is what Russia will make of this. Does Russia really want an end to this war?
Catherine, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed from a bright and beautiful Berlin.